Adolf Hitler, Germany, 1933 to 1945. Adolf Hitler's rise from a failed artist to the leader of Nazi Germany remains one of the most terrifying transformations in modern history. Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler's early life was marked by rejection and frustration. However, after World War I, he found his calling as a charismatic speaker who capitalized on Germany's post-war humiliation and economic hardship. In 1933, he became chancellor and swiftly consolidated power, turning Germany into a totalitarian state under the Nazi Party. His regime was built on Aryan supremacy, extreme nationalism, and militarism, with the goal of establishing a greater Germany. Hitler's aggressive foreign policies led directly to World War II, beginning with the invasion of Poland in 1939. But his most horrific legacy is the Holocaust, a systematic genocide that claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable. Under Hitler, concentration camps became sites of unspeakable atrocities. His reign ultimately led to the deaths of over 70 million people worldwide. As the Allies closed in on Berlin in 1945, Hitler retreated to his bunker, where he took his own life. The war ended, but the impact of his dictatorship left scars on the world. Hitler's reign is a chilling reminder of how unchecked power and hatred can lead to unparalleled destruction and loss. Joseph Stalin, Soviet Union, 1924 to 1953. Joseph Stalin's rule over the Soviet Union was marked by terror, repression, and ruthless consolidation of power. Born in 1878 in Georgia, Stalin rose through the ranks of the Communist Party following the Russian Revolution. By 1924, after Lenin's death, Stalin became the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union. He quickly implemented policies that would shape the nation's future in blood. Stalin's most notorious actions were the Great Purge, 1936 to 1938, during which he eliminated perceived enemies within the party, military, and society, resulting in the deaths of millions. He also oversaw forced collectivization, leading to a man-made famine that killed millions of peasants. His regime used secret police, propaganda, and a personality cult to maintain control. Despite the horrific toll of his domestic policies, Stalin led the Soviet Union through World War II, playing a key role in defeating Nazi Germany. However, his brutal methods continued, with mass deportations and the creation of a climate of fear across the country. By the time of his death in 1953, Stalin had transformed the Soviet Union into a global superpower, but at an immeasurable human cost, with millions of lives lost to purges, famine, and labor camps. Stalin's legacy is one of both industrialization and untold suffering. His reign reshaped the course of the 20th century, leaving a nation haunted by his tyranny. Pol Pot, Cambodia, 1975 to 1979. Pol Pot's brief but brutal rule over Cambodia stands as one of the most horrifying examples of totalitarianism in modern history. Born in 1925, Pol Pot was a communist revolutionary who rose to power through the Khmer Rouge, a radical group that sought to create an agrarian utopia. In 1975, Pol Pot seized control of Cambodia, determined to transform the country into a classless, rural society. Under Pol Pot, Cambodia became a nation of fear. The Khmer Rouge emptied cities, forcing millions of people into labor camps to work in the fields, all in the name of revolutionary ideals. Intellectuals, professionals, and anyone seen as a threat to the regime were executed, while others suffered from starvation, disease, and grueling forced labor. In just 4 years, an estimated 1.7 million people, around a quarter of the population, died due to execution, torture, and starvation. Pol Pot's regime was marked by paranoia and brutal oppression, as the Khmer Rouge sought to erase all traces of urban life and Western influence. The international community was slow to respond to the atrocities, and it wasn't until 1979, when Vietnam invaded Cambodia, that Pol Pot's reign of terror came to an end. Though Pol Pot's rule was short-lived, the devastation he caused left deep scars in Cambodia, and his legacy remains one of unspeakable cruelty and the destruction of an entire generation. Kim Jong-il, North Korea, 1994 to 2011. Kim Jong-il's rule over North Korea was defined by eccentricity, secrecy, and iron-fisted control. Born in 1941, Kim Jong-il took power after the death of his father, Kim Il-sung, the founding leader of North Korea. In 1994, he inherited a totalitarian state built on fear, surveillance, and cult worship. Kim Jong-il continued his father's policies of strict isolationism and authoritarian rule, creating one of the world's most repressive regimes. Known for his obsession with nuclear weapons and propaganda, Kim Jong-il developed North Korea's nuclear program, defying international pressure and sanctions. At the same time, he maintained an image of a godlike figure, controlling every aspect of life in North Korea through state propaganda. His government was notorious for its human rights violations, including forced labor camps and severe punishment for even the smallest dissent. One of the most bizarre aspects of Kim Jong-il's rule was his personal lifestyle. He surrounded himself with luxury, including a private film collection and a team of chefs. He was also known for his obsession with Hollywood, even reportedly kidnapping South Korean filmmakers to make movies glorifying North Korea. While the country's people endured famine and poverty, Kim Jong-il continued to live in excess, feeding the myth of his infallibility. Kim Jong-il passed away in 2011, leaving his son, Kim Jong-un, to inherit his position and continue the dynasty. His reign remains a chilling example of the lengths a dictator will go to maintain absolute control. Idi Amin, Uganda, 1971 to 1979. Idi Amin's reign over Uganda was a mix of madness, terror, and absurdity. Known as the Butcher of Uganda, Amin came to power in a military coup in 1971, overthrowing the democratically elected president. He quickly established a brutal dictatorship, ruling with an iron fist and gaining a reputation for his cruelty. His rule was characterized by violent repression, political purges, and widespread human rights abuses. Amin declared himself the conqueror of the British Empire and later, the King of Scotland, an attempt to justify his inflated ego. Under his leadership, Uganda became a state of chaos. Amin expelled tens of thousands of Indians and Pakistanis, seizing their businesses and assets, which led to an economic collapse. His regime was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 300,000 Ugandans, many of whom were tortured and executed under his orders. One of the most infamous aspects of Amin's rule was his unpredictable nature. He frequently made bizarre public statements, including claims of supernatural powers, and surrounded himself with an army of loyal henchmen. He also had a reputation for cannibalism, though it remains unclear if this was based on fact or the result of terrifying rumors. Amin's reign ended in 1979 when he was ousted by Tanzanian forces. He spent his final years in exile, living in Saudi Arabia, where he died in 2003. His time in power left Uganda scarred, a nation haunted by the legacy of his tyranny. Muammar Gaddafi, Libya, 1969 to 2011. Muammar Gaddafi's rule over Libya was as eccentric as it was tyrannical. Seizing power in a 1969 coup, Gaddafi overthrew the monarchy and established the Libyan Arab Republic. He ruled for over 4 decades, creating a regime based on his own interpretation of socialism and Islamic law. His Green Book became the ideological foundation of the state, promoting his vision of direct democracy, but in practice, his rule was anything but democratic. Gaddafi's leadership was marked by erratic behavior and extravagant gestures. He became infamous for his flamboyant wardrobe, which included gold-plated sunglasses, and his long stays in luxurious tents during international visits. While he presented himself as the protector of African unity and champion of anti-imperialism, his government used brutal repression to maintain control, silencing any opposition through imprisonment, torture, and execution. Despite his support for global terrorism and involvement in the Lockerbie bombing of 1988, Gaddafi managed to maintain a grip on power for years, partly through his country's vast oil wealth. However, in 2011, during the Arab Spring uprisings, his regime faced massive protests that escalated into a civil war. NATO forces intervened, and Gaddafi was eventually captured and killed by rebel forces. His death marked the end of an era, but Libya remains divided and unstable to this day, haunted by the aftermath of his brutal rule. Francisco Macías Nguema, Equatorial Guinea, 1968 to 1979. Francisco Macías Nguema's rule over Equatorial Guinea is one of the most horrific examples of a dictator turning a nation into a personal fiefdom. Macías came to power in 1968 after the country gained independence from Spain, but his leadership quickly turned into a nightmare. As the first president of Equatorial Guinea, Macías ruled with an iron fist, systematically purging anyone who was perceived as a threat. Under his regime, the country became a land of terror. He was known for his paranoia and extreme cruelty, executing thousands of his own citizens, including political rivals, intellectuals, and anyone who opposed him. His regime also saw widespread torture and imprisonment. In a particularly bizarre move, Macías declared himself the unique miracle and attempted to eradicate Christianity by forcing priests and religious figures to leave the country, while promoting an eerie form of personality worship. Macías' reckless mismanagement led to economic collapse, with most of the country living in poverty while he and his associates amassed wealth. His regime was characterized by corruption, inefficiency, and a complete disregard for the welfare of the people. After a coup in 1979, Macías was overthrown and executed by his nephew, Teodoro Obiang, who went on to rule the country in his place. Macías' legacy remains one of brutality and devastation for Equatorial Guinea, a nation that has struggled to recover from his reign. Leopold II, Belgium, 1865 to 1909. King Leopold II of Belgium is infamous for turning the Congo Free State into a personal colony, where millions suffered and died under brutal exploitation. Ascending to the throne in 1865, Leopold saw the Congo as a vast resource to be exploited, particularly for rubber and ivory. He obtained control over the territory in 1885 through a personal concession, presenting it to the world as a humanitarian mission to civilize the African people. In reality, Leopold's regime was marked by extreme cruelty. The Congolese were forced into brutal labor under threat of violence, with entire villages wiped out if they failed to meet rubber quotas. Workers were often mutilated, with hands severed as punishment for not meeting production goals. Estimates suggest that between 10 to 15 million Congolese people died as a result of forced labor, starvation, disease, and executions. Leopold's exploitation of the Congo was hidden for years, but by the early 20th century, international pressure mounted against his regime. In 1908, under scrutiny from global activists and reports of atrocities, Leopold was forced to relinquish control of the Congo, which became a Belgian colony. However, his legacy remains as one of the most grotesque examples of imperialist cruelty in history, with the scars of his actions continuing to affect the region today. Saddam Hussein, Iraq, 1979 to 2003. Saddam Hussein's rule over Iraq was defined by authoritarianism, brutality, and military aggression. Rising through the ranks of the Ba'ath Party, Saddam became president of Iraq in 1979 after a violent coup. He quickly consolidated power, establishing a dictatorship that would last for over 2 decades. His regime was built on fear, with widespread surveillance and brutal repression of political opponents. Saddam's most notorious acts were his genocidal campaigns against ethnic minorities, particularly the Kurds and Shiite Arabs. In 1988, during the Anfal campaign, he ordered the chemical weapons attack on the Kurdish town of Halabja, killing thousands and causing horrific injuries to countless others. This attack was part of a broader effort to suppress any opposition to his rule, with thousands of Kurds and Shiites tortured, executed, or sent to labor camps. Saddam's foreign policy also included brutal military actions. In 1980, he invaded Iran, triggering a devastating 8-year war that resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties. In 1990, his invasion of Kuwait led to the Gulf War, prompting international intervention and a crippling set of sanctions that further devastated Iraq's economy and infrastructure. Saddam Hussein was eventually overthrown by the US-led coalition in 2003. After a failed attempt to flee, he was captured, tried for crimes against humanity, and executed in 2006. His reign left Iraq in ruins, and the legacy of his brutal dictatorship continues to influence the country's political landscape today. Nicolae Ceaușescu, Romania, 1965 to 1989. Nicolae Ceaușescu's regime in Romania was marked by totalitarian control, cult of personality, and brutal repression. Coming to power in 1965, Ceaușescu initially gained international favor for his independent foreign policy and opposition to Soviet domination. However, as his rule progressed, he became increasingly isolated and tyrannical, ruling with an iron fist. Ceaușescu built a personality cult, presenting himself as the savior of Romania. He pushed through massive construction projects, including the construction of the enormous palace of the parliament, using forced labor and state funds, while ordinary Romanians endured extreme poverty. He imposed harsh austerity measures, redirecting resources to foreign debt payments and leaving the country's citizens with insufficient food, heat, and basic necessities. The regime also cracked down on any form of dissent, using the Securitate, secret police, to silence opponents and monitor the population. Perhaps most notorious was Ceaușescu's brutal crackdown on the 1989 anti-government protests, which sparked a nationwide revolution. On Christmas Day 1989, after fleeing Bucharest, Ceaușescu and his wife, Elena, were captured, tried in a summary court, and executed by firing squad. His fall marked the end of communist rule in Romania, but the scars left by his authoritarianism and the suffering of the Romanian people linger to this day. Augusto Pinochet, Chile, 1973 to 1990. Augusto Pinochet's rule over Chile was defined by military dictatorship, violent repression, and a relentless pursuit of power. Pinochet came to power in 1973 through a violent coup that ousted the democratically elected president, Salvador Allende. With the backing of the military, he declared himself president and established a brutal regime that lasted until 1990. Pinochet's regime was marked by widespread human rights violations, including the imprisonment, torture, and execution of thousands of political opponents. His secret police, known as the DINA, operated with impunity, disappearing people and conducting covert operations both within Chile and abroad. Under Pinochet, Chile became a society of fear, where even suspected dissenters were at risk of brutal retaliation. While Pinochet's economic policies led to rapid growth in some sectors, they also deepened inequality and left many Chileans in poverty. His government implemented free market reforms that favored the wealthy, and the consequences of this economic disparity were felt by the poor and working class, who suffered under the weight of the regime's oppressive tactics. Pinochet's dictatorship came to an end in 1990 when Chile transitioned back to democracy. However, his legacy remains deeply controversial. While he is seen by some as a stabilizing force during a turbulent time, many others view his reign as one of the most brutal and repressive in Latin American history. Francisco Franco, Spain, 1939 to 1975. Francisco Franco's nearly four-decade-long rule over Spain is remembered for its authoritarianism, nationalism, and repression. After leading a successful military coup in 1936, Franco emerged as the head of a fascist dictatorship, marking the start of the Spanish Civil War. In 1939, after defeating the Republican forces, he became the undisputed leader of Spain, a position he held until his death in 1975. Franco's regime was built on the suppression of political opposition, the eradication of regional languages and cultures, and the establishment of a centralized, nationalist government. He banned political parties, labor unions, and public dissent, ruling with the aid of military tribunals and a secret police force. His government was also responsible for mass executions and imprisonments during the Civil War and afterward, targeting anyone suspected of leftist or separatist sympathies. Under Franco, Spain remained neutral during World War II, but the country was isolated internationally for much of his rule. Despite economic difficulties and the lack of political freedoms, Spain's economy began to modernize in the 1960s, thanks to a series of economic reforms. However, the repression continued, with the regime maintaining strict control over the media, education, and public life. Franco's death in 1975 led to Spain's transition to democracy, but his legacy remains a subject of deep division in the country, with many still grappling with the scars of his authoritarian rule. Benito Mussolini, Italy, 1922 to 1943. Benito Mussolini, the founder of Italian fascism, ruled Italy with an iron fist from 1922 to 1943. Mussolini's rise to power was fueled by Italy's post-World War I instability, economic turmoil, and widespread discontent with the government. After founding the National Fascist Party, Mussolini became prime minister in 1922 following the March on Rome, a move that marked the beginning of his dictatorial reign. Mussolini's regime was built on intense nationalism, militarism, and a cult of personality. He sought to create a totalitarian state where the individual was subordinate to the state. Mussolini consolidated his power by suppressing political opposition, curbing free speech, and establishing a fascist-controlled media. He also implemented ambitious infrastructure projects, including the construction of new towns and highways, but these efforts were often overshadowed by his increasingly erratic leadership and desire for military expansion. His alliances with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan during World War II led Italy into a disastrous war, and by 1943, his government was collapsing. Mussolini was deposed and arrested, only to be rescued by German forces. After attempting to flee, he was captured by Italian partisans and executed in 1945. His body displayed publicly as a symbol of his ultimate downfall. Mussolini's reign left a lasting impact on Italy, with fascism remaining a controversial and painful chapter in the nation's history. His legacy is remembered for its brutal suppression of dissent, its role in the outbreak of World War II, and its lasting effects on Italian politics. Slobodan Milošević, Serbia/Yugoslavia, 1989 to 2000. Slobodan Milošević's rise to power in the late 1980s marked the beginning of a tumultuous and violent period in the Balkans. Elected president of Serbia in 1989, he soon extended his influence throughout the former Yugoslavia. Milošević is often associated with the brutal breakup of Yugoslavia and the bloody conflicts that followed, particularly the wars in Bosnia, Croatia, and Kosovo during the 1990s. Milošević's regime was defined by nationalism and authoritarianism, using state-controlled media and propaganda to stir up ethnic tensions and justify aggressive military actions. Under his rule, Serbia's government played a central role in the ethnic cleansing of Albanians, Croats, and Bosniaks. His forces were responsible for numerous war crimes, including the Srebrenica massacre in 1995, where thousands of Bosnian Muslim men and boys were killed by Serb forces, and the forced displacement of entire communities. In 1999, NATO intervened in Kosovo, launching a bombing campaign against Serbian forces, leading to the eventual withdrawal of Serbian troops. By 2000, Milošević was overthrown in a peaceful revolution, but his legacy of war crimes and nationalist rhetoric left the region deeply scarred. Milošević was later tried for war crimes at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He died in 2006 before a verdict could be reached, but his reign continues to be a painful chapter in the history of the Balkans, a reminder of the horrors of ethnic conflict and the dangers of unchecked power. Ruhollah Khomeini, Iran, 1979 to 1989. Ruhollah Khomeini was the revolutionary leader who transformed Iran from a Western-backed monarchy into an Islamic theocracy, forever altering the course of the nation's history. In 1979, Khomeini led the Islamic revolution that overthrew the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and brought the monarchy to an end. Once in power, Khomeini established the Islamic Republic of Iran, with himself as the supreme leader, wielding absolute authority over the government, military, and judiciary. Khomeini's rule was marked by brutal repression, particularly against political opponents, intellectuals, and anyone perceived as a threat to his vision of an Islamic state. His regime imposed strict Islamic laws, curtailing freedoms and imposing severe punishments for violations. Women's rights were particularly curtailed under Khomeini's rule, with the enforcement of the mandatory hijab and the marginalization of women from many sectors of society. Khomeini's foreign policy was equally radical. He sought to export the Iranian Revolution, supporting militant groups and Islamist movements across the Middle East. His government also initiated the Iran-Iraq War in 1980, a devastating conflict that lasted 8 years and resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties. Khomeini's death in 1989 marked the end of his direct influence, but his vision for Iran continues to shape the country's politics and policies to this day. His regime's oppressive tactics and the war with Iraq left deep scars on the nation, and his legacy remains divisive, viewed by some as a liberator and by others as a brutal tyrant. The dictators we've covered left legacies of destruction and suffering, but their stories are powerful reminders of the dangers of unchecked power. What can we do to prevent history from repeating itself? Let's learn from the past, stand against injustice, and fight for freedom. If this video sparked something in you, like, share, and subscribe. Drop your thoughts in the comments. How can we create a future free from tyranny? Together, we can make a difference.